ஆமா. அந்த மாரி போட்டுருக்காங்க. ம். அதுதான்.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our national level online faculty development program on recent trends in English studies. Daniel Bernard says, trauma is personal. It does not disappear if it is not validated. When it is ignored or invalidated, the silent screams continue internally heard only by the one held captive. Yes. In today's session, we are going to explore trauma theories. Before that, let us begin this enlightening day with a moment of reflection and prayer. I kindly request Mrs. J. Christy Lydia Johnsey to lead us in prayer.
Let's begin the day with a prayer. Dear Lord Jesus, I'll extol you, my God the King. I'll praise your name forever and ever. We thank you for being gracious to us on the second day of our faculty development program. We seek your guidance for our educators gathered in pursuit of knowledge and professional development. Dear Lord, may the session be filled with insightful discussions, encouraging the exchange of ideas that spark innovation in teaching and learning. Dear Lord, may each participant find renewed enthusiasm for their roles and lead us to have a lasting collaborations. May the spirit of continuous improvement guide them as they shape the future of education. Dear Lord, bless everyone gathered here and especially our resource person. We ask all these things in the matchless name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Christy ma'am, for guiding us in the moment of introspection. Next, let's delve into a passage from the Bible. May I invite Ms. Samlin Golda to read a passage from the Bible.
Good morning, everyone. The reading portion for today is taken from the book of Psalms 145, verses beginning to read from 1 to 7. I will extol thee, my God, O King, and I will bless thy name forever and ever. Every day will I bless thee, and I will praise thy name forever and ever. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall praise thy works to another, and shall declare thy mighty acts. I will speak of the glorious honor of thy majesty and of thy wondrous works. And men shall speak of the might of thy terrible acts, and I will declare thy greatness. They shall abundantly utter the memory of thy great goodness, and shall sing of thy righteousness. Here ends the reading. Praise be to God.
Thank you, Ms. Samlin Golda, for sharing those profound words. Welcome is the word that is heard the least, yet means the most. Catherine Pulsifer. Now let's officially inaugurate today's session with a warm welcome address. I invite Dr. M. Beulah Hemalada to extend a warm welcome to the chief guest and participants.
Thank you, Dr. Ju. It is indeed a privilege and pleasure to welcome esteemed faculty members, respected attendees, and the renowned resource person of today, Professor Joy Sophie, Assistant Professor of English, Ethiraj College for Women, Chennai. On behalf of the PG and Research Department of English, a warm welcome to the resource person. We eagerly anticipate gaining valuable insights from your vast knowledge in literature. Thank you so much for gracing with us today. And I also intend to express my gratitude to the Secretary of our college, Mr. S. Prem Kumar Rajasingh, and our Principal, Dr. B. Jawahar Samuel, for their support and appreciation. Once again, hearty welcome to each and every one of you gathered today. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for setting the tone for today's discussion. Moving forward, it's an honor to introduce our esteemed chief guest, resource person, Dr. Joy Sophie. Now I invite Mrs. T. Eunice Salome to introduce our chief guest, who will enlighten us on trauma theories.
Good morning, everyone. With immense joy and happiness, I'm here to introduce the resource person and my close friend, Ms. Joy Sophie, as today's speaker. Joy Sophie and I have known each other for years, and we have shared many experiences together. She is a meticulous student in her school and colleges and always enthusiastic to learn new things. She has even completed Korean beginners course at Yonsei University in South Korea, reflecting her growing passion for Korean language and literature. Joy Sophie is a remarkable person with a strong interest in literature, theories, and criticism, with a particular focus on women's studies, post-colonial studies, and literary criticism. She is an avid reader since her childhood, as she has finished reading Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights when she was in her 3rd standard. She is a gifted storyteller, a motivational speaker, and she is a well-versed in variety of teaching techniques. She is an excellent communicator with a strong command of language and a deep understanding of the subject. She is incredibly kind, intelligent, and supportive of her students. She has also hosted an online book club where she engages participants in enriching discussions about literature and theories. She is a talented creative writer. She earned Silver Prize for script writing from IFP in 2022. Her short story collection titled Ellipses of the Silenced was published in the year 2021. She has distinguished records of presenting and publishing papers at national and international seminars and conferences. She has also organized and co-organized various seminars and competitions at Mother Teresa University. Holding an UG, PG, and MPhil degrees from prestigious colleges and university, and having cleared NET exam, she is currently working as an assistant professor at Ethical College. She is here with us today to share her knowledge over the topic trauma theory. With pride and gratitude, I welcome our esteemed speaker and my friend, Ms. Joy Sophie, to share her profound insight with us. Thank you, Joy, for gracing us with your presence. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Eunice, for that introduction. Good morning. Before I start my presentation, I would like to thank the Secretary of the College, Mr. Prem Kumar Rajasingh, the Principal, Dr. Jawahar Samuel, and the Head, Jude Livingston, Sir, and Dr. Mrs. Beulah Hemalata for giving me this very fruitful opportunity. And I also thank my beloved friend Eunice for this very elaborate introduction. Thank you. So let me share my screen first. Is the screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, it is visible.
Thank you.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, so today I would like to give a very brief overview of trauma and trauma studies in literature. I'm just going to talk about what trauma is and what it means to study trauma in literature. And I've made use of a lot of examples so that the session will be very interesting and effective as well. So before we begin, I would like to ask you all a question as to what trauma is actually, because in the present modern age, we've seen a lot of movies and series and in social media as well, where the words trauma and trigger and gaslighting are being used very casually. And we see a lot of memes and jokes being made of about therapy and trauma, etc. So I would like to ask the audience as to what you think about trauma. What is your definition of trauma? You can take a minute to think about it and you can leave your answers in the chat box. We even hear friends telling about their childhood trauma, and they say that they've been traumatized by their friend or by their family member. Okay, an incident that left deep scars, the mental pressure suffered. Okay. Scar in the psyche. Okay, bad experience in the past. Depression and deep wounds from childhood. Okay. So basically, trauma has something to do with the mind. And as I have shared on the screen, you can see a lot of memes about trauma, both in Tamil and in English. And it has become a very common term to be used by youngsters of this age. And yes, so trauma has something to do with the mind, and we've come to a conclusion that trauma is a very intense experience which will alter your psyche, the way, and it also alters your identity as a person, and it also alters the way you look at the world through your eyes, because your mind or your psyche has been altered because of that experience. But we have come a long way. Trauma has always been there since the beginning of time. It is an anthropological constant, which means that since the beginning of human beings, since the beginning of time, trauma has always been there. For example, I would like to give you a few examples from the Bible. We wouldn't have used the word trauma in the Bible, but we have stories of characters like Ruth and Naomi, who loses their husbands consequently, and they move to a new land. That itself is trauma. Migrating from one place to another, and losing their partners and starting a life anew itself is trauma. And we have the story of King David in the Bible, who keeps running from the previous king Saul, who tries to kill him. David is always in the fight or flight mode, where he's always hiding from the king, afraid for his life. So we have a lot of stories about trauma, right from religious aspects and mythologies and oral narrations of stories. Okay, but the first time the word trauma was used is during the 1860s in connection to railway incidents or accidents. So in the 1800s, we had the Industrial Revolution, and we had the railway systems, the steam engines and all coming in, and we had people traveling, taking the train to travel to places. And there were many incidents where two trains collided with each other, or there were incidents where the train was derailed from the tracks, and people met with serious or minor injuries. Okay, and after a few days of these injuries, these passengers or the people who worked in the railways, they came back to the railway company, or they went back to their doctors, saying that they're experiencing tremors or shiverings in their body, and they're experiencing nausea, they feel like vomiting. These are days after the incident happened. Okay, and the doctors were not able to pinpoint the reason for it. The doctors did not know the reason for the sudden symptoms that came out of nowhere after a few or many days after the incident. And one doctor from England calls it the railway spine, saying that the problem is due to an injury to the spinal cord of the patient. So maybe during the railway accident, the patient would have suffered an injury to their spinal cord, and that is why they're having all these symptoms after a few days. But there was another doctor called Herbert Page and from England, and another doctor from Berlin, Germany, called Hermann Oppenheim, who spoke about the psyche or the mind, and they said that it is not about the physical injuries, and it is about the mind. Maybe they were mentally disturbed. Traumatic neurosis. Hermann Oppenheim uses the word traumatic neurosis, saying that maybe these people were mentally disturbed because of the accident, and that is why they're experiencing these symptoms after a few days of the accident. Okay, so this is where Hermann Oppenheim is the first person who uses the word trauma to talk about mental injuries and not physical injuries, because the word trauma comes from the Greek word for wound, which means physical wound. But Oppenheim is the first person to use trauma as a term for mental injuries. Okay, and after Hermann Oppenheim, we had John Martin Charcot and Pierre Janet. Pierre Janet and Sigmund Freud were classmates, and John Martin Charcot and Pierre Janet, they started working on a model of the psyche, trying to understand the mental injuries that happen to people due to such severe incidents like an accident or the loss of a dead person, of a beloved person. And they started working on a framework to understand mental injuries. And Martin Charcot also talks about how traumatic neurosis is actually not related to physical injuries. It is actually something related to the mind. He confirmed what Hermann Oppenheim had theorized before. And Pierre Janet is very important because he talks about the term dissociation. Dissociation is a very important term. It talks about how a person is completely split into two personalities when something very traumatic happens. Their mind is not able to comprehend the impact of the incident that has happened to them. So the mind basically splits into two to protect the brain from collapsing because of the incident. So Pierre Janet gives a very basic model of the psyche and the impact of the traumatic incident, which will cause dissociation in a person. The best example for dissociation would be the Tamil movie Anniyan, where the hero has split personality. His personality splits into multiple personalities because of the trauma he experienced during his childhood, watching his sister die, and the things that happens around him makes his psyche split into multiple personalities. So you basically dissociate yourself from your brain. That is what trauma does to you because of the intensity of the incident. So Pierre Janet's model of the psyche and the concept of dissociation can be said as the first stepping stone towards trauma studies as a serious form of studies. And Sigmund Freud based most of his theories based on Pierre Janet's psyche model. And Sigmund Freud said that he included a point saying that this traumatic neurosis, this dissociation all happens because of the sexual abuse that a child faces during their childhood. But this was decredited in the later years. You can go through the slides. So Sigmund Freud, he adopted most of Janet's ideas of the psyche model and all that, as I said before. And he included his own points, which were mostly discredited by the later theorists and all. But Sigmund Freud can be said as the person who created the base for what trauma actually is and what trauma studies actually is. Okay, he said that trauma is actually an injury in the mind, and it needs to be treated in a very delicate manner. And he also confirmed that trauma is very unpredictable. The symptoms might not appear immediately. When a person gets into an accident or when a person loses their loved one, sometimes the impact of trauma cannot be seen immediately in them. It might take like 1 or 2 days or even weeks for some people to come to terms with what has happened and for their body and their mind to react to that trauma. So it all depends on the person. And Sigmund Freud also studied the impact of war on soldiers during World War I, and we had this term during the World War I called shell shocked. We had many soldiers who fought in the World War I coming back home. You can look at the picture, you can look at how bizarre it is. The soldier is sitting there in the trenches and he's basically laughing in a very wild manner. So it is called war neurosis, where people, they are not scared, they are confused, and they are in a place where their psyche is not able to observe the impact that the war has had on them. They would have faced bomb blasts and violence in war, and that would have impacted their psyche in a very powerful manner, that they are not able to return back to normal. That is the problem. Our brain has a protective shield which will protect us from very powerful emotions and impacts, but traumatic incidents like war or natural disasters or dying, such stuff, it penetrates this protective shield, and it changes a person completely. And symptoms of shell shock could be tremors, and people will have nightmares and hallucinations. They will not know where they are, and all these things cannot be controlled at all. Particularly in the 1900s, they didn't have good medicines or psychotherapy to treat people with such conditions. People were not able to understand what these soldiers were going through. Okay. And only after the World War II and Vietnam War did people understand that this is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And Freud was the one who studied all these things in the soldiers, in the experience of soldiers in the battlefield. So, as I said, Freud and his theories are the basis for trauma studies. So after the World War II and Vietnam War, we had many soldiers who returned home shell-shocked, and we had many soldiers who could not return to their regular life after being in the war. And they had frequent tremors and nightmares and hallucinations, and they'll hear voices, imaginary voices, like someone is continuously talking to them, and they'll keep reimagining the same battlefield or same traumatic situation again and again. And this is not voluntary. It happens to them out of nowhere. It is not controllable at all. Such PTSD symptoms are not controllable at all. And it keeps happening again and again at unpredictable times. You cannot say that traumatic symptoms will appear only in the morning or in the evening or when a person is sleeping. You cannot predict when those symptoms will appear. Okay. And another thing is that not only did the soldiers suffer, the people who survived the war also suffered with survivor syndrome. Mostly people who survive an earthquake or a bomb blast or any life-changing, life-altering incident, they will have survivor syndrome. They'll be very guilty of being alive while other people have died. So this was also another form of trauma, where they were not able to process that they are alive while their family members or someone else has died. Okay, so people had survivor syndrome, particularly people after the World War II, the Holocaust survivors. Holocaust is what Hitler did to the Jewish people, and millions of Jewish people died. Yet many Jewish people, they found ways to escape from Germany. They escaped to other European countries and they escaped to America. And these Jewish people who escaped from Germany, they had survivor syndrome, where they were very guilty for escaping while other people passed away in a very traumatic manner. And soldiers who returned from Vietnam War also had post-Vietnam syndrome. They could not adjust to their life back in America. They did not know how to go back to being normal, to lead a very normal or to have a routine life like how they had before the war. So we had traumas on the other side as well, where you are a survivor, but you're very shameful or guilty of having survived the trauma. I have 3 examples here. All these movies are based on books, and the first one is a romance novel, actually, The Lucky One. But there you have a hero who has returned from the war, and he lost his friend in a combat, and he comes back home, but still he keeps having frequent nightmares and hallucinations of abandoning his friend in the battlefield, and he keeps feeling guilty for leaving his friend behind, his friend's dead body behind in the battlefield. And the whole story is about how he tries to handle his trauma, his PTSD of losing his friend in the battlefield. And he meets his friend's sister, who's mourning the death of her brother. And so her trauma is in a different manner. She has a very personal trauma, individual trauma, where she is handling the death of her brother. And the second movie, Brothers, is about how there are two brothers, and one brother who goes to the Vietnam War and he comes back and he's not the same person again. Because I'm sorry, it's not the Vietnam War, it's the Afghan War. And he goes to Afghanistan. And he's caught there by the Afghanistan terrorists, and he's asked to kill his own group member so that he can be free. And in the end, he kills that man and he gets his freedom and he escapes from Afghanistan and he comes back to America. And in America, he's not able to lead a very normal life. He starts hallucinating and he thinks that his wife and his brother are having an affair. And he thinks that, people are, there's some disturbance. Okay. And he thinks that his brother and his wife are cheating behind him. He hallucinates that there are people who are listening to his conversations, who are waiting to kill him. He hallucinates that his wife is waiting to kill him. And he has nightmares. He doesn't know how to talk properly to his children. His daughters start hating him. And in the end, he has a mental breakdown and he's taken to a mental asylum. So, and in Haunting in Venice is an Agatha Christie movie. And in that, we have one doctor who's back from World War I. And this doctor, he worked as a doctor in the battlefield. And when he comes back home after the war, he's completely useless. He hears imaginary voices and he hallucinates that he's surrounded by enemies. And all his family and friends are conspiring to, kill him or to get him into trouble. He doesn't even know how to communicate with his 10-year-old son properly. And his practice as a doctor is completely hopeless. So these are few examples as to how PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder happens and how it impacts the mind of a person. So basically, trauma can be an event or a series of events. Series of events means continuous abuse from a parent or from a spouse or even in your workplace. Okay, it can be series of events or it can be just one event, an accident or a natural disaster or someone passed away. But it affects your mind so much that you cannot function as a normal human being again. That is what trauma is. Okay, so there are different types of trauma. You cannot say that one trauma is bigger than the other. They're all equal. So a trauma can be as big as a war, or it can be as simple as a parent abusing a child, or classmates bullying a child in school for being fat or for being lean or for being fair or dark or whatever it is. So trauma can be very big incidents or very small incidents that might impact your mind forever. See, that is why when some adults, when they behave in a particular way because they were traumatized by either their parents or someone during their childhood, that they're not able to come out of it. If a father was abusive during their childhood, they tend to choose partners who are like their father, who's very abusive, who might hit them. Okay, and they think that is what manhood is because that is the kind of example that they had during their childhood. And children who are being bullied for being fat, when they grow up, they might not like eating food. They might have eating disorders, and they might not like talking about food with people because they've been traumatized for eating a lot of food or for liking food. So this is the overall idea of what trauma is, and you must understand the effect of trauma as well. It is very impactful. It can go from minor symptoms like headaches, and sometimes when an incident so traumatic happens, people will lose memories of that incident, or they'll lose memories of what happened before that incident. Their childhood memories and all that will be gone because of their trauma. And people might have severe symptoms like suicidal thoughts or nightmares or hopelessness, and they'll have hallucinations and hearing voices. And one common symptom of trauma is that they'll start abusing substance like alcohol, drugs, and sometimes it may lead to sexual, habits as well. So you must understand that from the 1860s, it took a lot of years for people to work on what trauma is and to understand the different types of trauma and how it begins and what are the symptoms and how to treat people. Treating people came only in the end of 20th century and the 21st century. So after knowing the idea of trauma, we'll come into trauma studies in literature. So we have three prominent people who can be called the pioneers of trauma studies: Kathy Caruth, Shoshana Feldman, and Dory Locke. Kathy Caruth is the main theorist of when it comes to trauma studies. She published two works called Trauma Explorations in Memory and Unclaimed Experience, Trauma Narrative and History in the 1990s. And only after that, we had this field of trauma studies itself in literature beginning and flourishing. And like feminism, trauma studies is a very big umbrella term. You can include gender, post-colonial studies, and you can include sociology, psychology, and a lot of other studies into trauma studies. It is all interrelated. And Kathy Caruth, she particularly uses, why I gave you an introduction to Sigmund Freud's research and all, is because Kathy Caruth took her foundational ideas from Sigmund Freud's research only. And she comes to the following conclusions. She says that trauma is an injury inflicted on the mind, okay? And it is not a simple event. Trauma is very complex and it is very unassimilated and unpredictable. And it is an oscillation between the unbearable nature of the event and the unbearable nature of its survival. So the event itself will be very unbearable, the traumatic event, and surviving after that is even more hard. It is even more tough, okay? And as I said, it is uncontrollable and the symptoms might be delayed. So just because someone is not crying, just because someone is not reacting the way we want them to, doesn't mean that they are not traumatized. It will take some time for them to process, for their brain to process the event and to, have the symptoms. So there is a paradox here. Kathy Caruth, she says, trauma is unrepresentable. You cannot represent trauma. You cannot use language to represent trauma because it is something to do with the person's individual experience with their psyche, and it cannot be explained with words, in language, okay? And there is another opposite argument from her saying that it can be expressed, trauma can be expressed because it is very authentic. That experience of a particular group or a particular person or a race or a gender is very authentic and it can be expressed using language. The reality or the truth of trauma can be explained through language. So there is a paradox whether trauma can be represented or not, and that is where literature comes in. So Jeffrey Hartman, he says that literature can be used to express or represent trauma. So language and memories play a role here, and memory studies is also a part of trauma studies. And Jeffrey Hartman, he says, with the use of language and memories, literature can be used as a medium to testify or to use as a medium as a testimony to psychological wounds. So when you have troubles, when you have mental issues, or when you have traumatic events happening to you, you can basically use literature to convey your feelings or to share your traumatic experience with the readers of the world. For example, we had poets like confessional poets like Sylvia Plath, who was traumatized because of her father's death when she was a young girl. And later she was you can see the classic symptoms of trauma in Sylvia Plath's life. She's very suicidal, and towards the end of her life, she's very depressed and she feels very alone. Her mind never stops thinking. You can read about it in her unabridged diary entries and all. And she chooses a man who looks similar to her father. She goes for Ted Hughes, the famous British poet, and that marriage is also very traumatic for her. She undergoes child loss, okay, and she's been domestically abused by Ted Hughes, and all this is revealed in her poetry and in her novels. She doesn't open her mouth and give a press meet or a statement, but everything is seen in her writings, in her poems, and in the metaphors that she uses in the poem Daddy. And there is another poem by Sylvia Plath called Tulips, which talks about losing a child, and she's lying there in a medical bed, wearing white, and she feels like she's, somewhere almost near drowning, where she feels like committing suicide. And that is not told to us directly, it is told to us in the form of a poem, using metaphors and personifications of the flowers, tulips. Okay, so Geoffrey Hartman and Kathy Karut, they believe that literature can be used as a medium to represent trauma. Since our early days, we would have studied that literature is the reflection of society, literature is the reflection of life, and literature is the voice for the voiceless. So basically, that is the concept here. People who have been silenced by trauma, people who are not able to express their pain, their mental agony, can use literature to express their trauma in the form of poetry or drama or novels. So that is called traumatic literature. And there are a few differences between literature in general and trauma literature. Traumatic literature, it uses figurative language, as I said, and the narrative structures will not be very linear like how it is in regular literature. You'll have a lot of flashbacks, a lot of reenactments, and you will have a lot of dissociative states. Sometimes one character will be talking about something, and out of nowhere they'll be talking about their past, or they'll be talking about something entirely different. So dissociative concepts will be there in the middle of the story, and we'll have characters who keep returning to their flashback. A very classic example for this would be Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where we have Clarissa Dalloway preparing for a party, but she keeps going back to her past, and the story oscillates between the past and the present. And we have Septimus, a war veteran who's going crazy in the park. His wife tries to soothe him, to take care of him, but then he is stuck with PTSD from the war, and in the end he commits suicide. So we have two different stories here, with Clarissa thinking about her life, her choices, and getting ready for the party. And on the other hand, we have a wounded soldier who has returned from war and has PTSD and doesn't know how to go on with life. So we have flashbacks, we have reenactments, and we have dissociative states. And Clarissa, for her, Septimus is a complete stranger, but when she hears the news of his death, she thinks about him, and she thinks that he has made the better choice by committing suicide than living this soulless life. Okay, so that is a very good classic example for trauma literature. And then this theorist called Joshua Pedersen, he talks about three tropes of trauma that you can see in literature. One is absence. The story will be based on the trauma of the author, or the trauma that the author is trying to convey, but it will not be there directly. You can read between the lines and understand what the author is talking about. For example, Still I Rise, the poem Still I Rise by Maya Angelou, she doesn't directly say that I'm writing this to the white people, or this is to the oppression of Black people. She doesn't say it directly, but the poem does it. Okay, because she calls herself a Black ocean, and she says that up from the roots of the history's past that she will rise. So basically, when you read the poem in between the lines, and when you read it with the context, you understand that she's referring to the traumatic event of the racial trauma that her ancestors had to undergo. So absence. So without talking about the trauma, these authors will be able to convey the trauma through silences and gaps in the text. And indirection is when a completely unrelated event will refer to the traumatic event. For example, Clarissa and Septimus here. And repetition is when the text keeps circling around the same traumatic event again and again. For example, if a protagonist is raped and she has trauma because of that, whatever relationship she gets into, or whatever friendship, or wherever she goes, that trauma of being raped, that physical violation keeps coming back to her mind, and all her actions and her conversations reflect the trauma that she has. So the text will keep circling back to the traumatic event through dialogues, through scenes and conversations. Okay, so these are the three tropes of trauma. So basically, we can say that trauma studies is when you represent trauma in language and using memory. And we also learn how trauma shapes a person and their identity and a cultural and the identity of a culture or a race or a gender as well. So there are different areas of trauma studies. We have individual and collective trauma, where individual trauma is when a person undergoes trauma because of their gender or sexuality, or because they belong to a particular race or nationality, or because they belong to a particular religion or a caste. For example, author Bama's writings will come under individual trauma or collective trauma of caste. Based on her caste, she has been discriminated, and that has been reflected in her works. And historical trauma can be wars, genocides, killing a large group of people of the same community, the Holocaust. Actually, trauma studies first concentrated on the Holocaust and the 9/11 incident that happened in United States of America. So the Holocaust literature is also a very big thing, where it talks about Hitler's annihilation of the Jewish people using concentration camps and various torture methods. And I told you, people escaping from such places having survivor syndrome. And we have intergenerational trauma, where the people who survived Holocaust also wrote poems and stories, told their stories to people, and their future generation, their children or their grandchildren wrote stories about it. There are intergenerational trauma where the legacies of their parents or great grandparents' experiences were passed on to the children, who in turn told it to their children and wrote stories or spoke about it. For example, African American literature is like that, where trauma of racial discrimination had been passed on from Maya Angelou's grandmother to Maya Angelou's mother, then Maya Angelou. And apart from racial trauma, Maya Angelou also undergoes sexual trauma by being raped at a very young age. So she has sexual trauma as well. So these are a few examples. And trauma studies also includes sadness, melancholia, and memories, and how these memories and sadness and resilience and all these things, how they frame a person's identity. As I said, once a person experiences a very traumatic incident, they'll not be the same person again. And not sometimes, nowadays we have therapy and many treatments for trauma. So, but before, being very resilient and bouncing back from a traumatic experience to being normal was very difficult. But now we have a lot of help from therapy and other treatments, where we are able to overcome our trauma and get back to a normal living. So there are literatures which celebrates surviving trauma, which celebrates people overcoming their trauma and living a very normal life as well. So I have a few examples here. I hope you all know the poem Home Burial by Robert Frost. It is based on his own experience of losing a child. And Still I Rise, I've already told you, Mrs. Dalloway as well. And Pachinko is from South Korean literature. It's I don't think it's a translated work. It's by an American Korean writer. And it talks about Japanese colonization of South Korea and how it impacted 3 generations of a family. The heroine of the story, the protagonist of the story, will be raped by a Japanese man in the name of love, and she'll carry his child and she'll be married off to a South Korean pastor, and she'll move to Japan with that pastor, and she'll start her family there. And their family will face all the discrimination as Koreans in a Japanese land, and they'll try to survive. And after 3 generations only, the family will be able to have a very decent living there. And still, this protagonist's grandchild will have identity crisis, whether to be a Japanese or a Korean. They will not know how to behave, and in the end, one of the sons will commit suicide. So we have the intergenerational trauma as well as colonial trauma there. The Hate You Give is by an African American author, Angie Thomas. It is based on real incidents that happened in America, the crime against African American people. In this novel, you have a set of teenagers, and a teenage boy there is shot in front of the protagonist just because he was fooling around with the shoe brush. and the police will think that it is a gun and they'll shoot the boy, and the girl will witness all this and she'll be traumatized for life. She'll have nightmares, she'll have severe sweating and fever and all that, and despite all that, she'll choose to fight for her friends life, to fight for justice, and she'll create a movement in her community where they'll fight to ask the white police to resign, the police who shot the boy to resign. Okay. So this is the hate you give is one example of being resilient and coming out of trauma in a very positive manner. And The Glory is a Korean series where it talks about bullying and childhood abuse. A young girl is actually, South Korea is known for its domestic violence and school abuse, childhood abuse and all. And this young girl is being abused in her school by her high school friends. Abuse is not in a simple way like verbal abuse and all. She'll be, burnt. Her hands and her legs will be burnt with the hair straighteners and all, and she'll have cigarette marks all over her body. She'll be sexually abused as well, and this girl will be so traumatized that she'll try to commit suicide during her school days, but then she'll be saved by one of her classmate. And when she grows up remembering that trauma again and again, and the scars in her body will be in a very visible proof of what she underwent, and she'll decide to take revenge on these people who traumatized her during her childhood. So the whole series is very dark, and it shows the negative side of what trauma can do to you as a person. It shatters her identity. She works as a school teacher. She'll be very kind as an adult and all that, but deep down she'll be very rageful, very angry, very vengeful to get revenge against these people who abused her, who took away her childhood. And racial trauma, we have The Color Purple, The Things Fall Apart, and Half of Yellow Sun. Half of Yellow Sun is about the Nigerian civil war that happens and how a family is affected by it. Things Fall Apart is post-colonial or colonial trauma, where white men come into a tribe's place and how things start changing, and the protagonist is not able to accept those changes from traditional values and all. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is also an example for colonial trauma from Canada. Train to Pakistan is partition between India and Pakistan. And Norwegian Wood is a novel by a Japanese writer, renowned Japanese writer, Haruki Murakami. And it talks about suicide and the trauma of a man because of his friend committing suicide when they were young. And the impact of his friend dying at a very young age, it impacts him as an adult as well, where he's not able to make meaningful relationships or nor friendships as well. He becomes a loner because of his friend dying at a very young age. And towards the end of the novel, he learns how to come out of it and how to communicate his feelings to other people, and how to, live life in a very meaningful manner, not being caught by the past. So this is also a very positive example of coming out of trauma. And A Little Life is one of the most traumatic novels of the 21st century. It talks about 4 friends in America who have their own troubles, and one person will be very suicidal and will be abused sexually and domestically. And in the end, I think one of them commits suicide. I read it long back, and it's one of the most impactful novel which actually talks about the seriousness of trauma and what it can do to a person. And we also have proof of serial killers who have been traumatized in their childhood. And there are studies which say that people who have been traumatized in their childhood can turn out to be serial killers if they're not, checked properly, or if they're not given the love and attention that they want. Ted Bundy is is an infamous serial killer who started killing women with red hair and with partition in the center because he had a girlfriend who broke up with him with the same hairstyle and the same hair. So he started finding women with similar hairstyle and similar hair color, and he started killing them. And when when the police caught him and when they got to know about his past and all, they realized that he had a very traumatic past, because he didn't know who his father was. His mother was a mistress to someone else, and people kept making fun of him for being a mistress's son, and that impacted him very badly, and he started hating women at a very young age. And the saddest thing is that Ted Bundy was working as a suicide prevention volunteer, and meanwhile he was killing women on the other hand. Okay, so if he had been given proper attention, if the society was a little bit kind to him, he wouldn't have turned out into a serial killer. And Jeffrey Dahmer is another example of a parents divorce. His parents got divorced and they neglected the child. The child grew up with grandparents, with his grandmother particularly, and his father, a chemist, he taught him about chemicals and all that, but he didn't bother to bond with his son much emotionally. And Jeffrey Dahmer, he grew up craving the attention of men, and that led him to kill young boys and later men, okay, for his sexual gratification and for his emotional gratification as well. So there are studies which say that traumatic incidents could lead to, such intense outcomes as well, as to a person becoming a serial killer, or to become or to have split personalities where their psyche is split into two, unable to bear the trauma of having their parents separated, or having lost their childhood friend, or sister or brother, or whoever it is. These two movies are also an example for that. I hope you all would have watched these movies. Okay. Before finishing my talk on trauma, I just wanted to give you two examples. You can read these novels if you're interested. I've taken two extreme opposites. Okay, one is from a Lithuanian background, the other is from South Korea. So both these novels, they talk about intergenerational, historical, and individual trauma. And Ruta Sepetys, she's a Lithuanian American author, and she wrote she's famous for many of her works, particularly for her historical fiction. This particular novel, Salt to the Sea, it talks about World War II, a particular incident that happened in World War II. And this novel talks about intergenerational trauma. Actually, in an interview, she talks about how her father's cousin told her to write the story about Lithuanian people and what happened to them during the World War II, because most of us concentrate on Japanese history or American and English history when it comes to World War I and II. And we don't consider reading about Poland or Lithuania or Prussia and all. So her father's cousin told her that she actually witnessed a lot of things during the World War II, and she wanted the author to write about her trauma. So this is intergenerational trauma. The author did not undergo such things, but her relative underwent such things, and she borrowed the story from her and she wrote this novel. So let me ask you a question. When I say ship sinking, which ship does come to your mind? Which ship comes to your mind? Ship sinking, or movies about
Titanic.
ship. Yes, Titanic. Okay. Okay, so everyone has said Titanic. Okay. So this particular novel is about another ship called Wilhelm Gustloff. This ship actually existed during the 1930s and till 1945. And in Titanic, only people 1,500 or 1,800 people passed away, and we are all very sad about it. We've made a movie about it, which has won a lot of Oscar awards. And again, it's white man's history, and we are all very sad that Jack and Rose died. But here in Wilhelm Gustloff, we had 9,400 people dying during the World War II, and nobody knew about this incident until this lady wrote this book. Okay, so that is why this book is historically very important. It is a historical fiction, but it is based on real events, which brought out the story of a ship sinking with 9,400 civilians in it. Okay, and I'll just tell you the story in brief. You can go and read it. It has all the characteristics of how a trauma literature should be. And the story is split between 4 characters. We have characters, the minorities are the characters here, the refugees are the characters here. and it is happening in East Prussia during the end of the World War II. And you have a Jewish man, a German, Lithuanian woman, Polish women, all these minorities who are afraid of Hitler. They're all running away from Germany, and they hear about this ship that is taking refugees away from Germany. And all these characters, they want to board the ship. So everybody, almost like lakhs of people, are walking towards the harbor, towards the ship, so that they can board the ship and they can escape the war, particularly Hitler's rule. And all these people, it is not a very simple journey. All the way they have doubts about each other. The Jewish man does not trust the German man. The Polish girl does not trust anyone because she's pregnant, being raped by a Russian soldier. She has her own trauma of being sexually raped, abused, and she's pregnant at the young age of 16, not knowing what to do. And she's a minority, she's a refugee there. And there is a Lithuanian nurse who's ready to help people, but she has her own guilt for letting her family die. So each character has their own trauma, and the hero is running away from Hitler. Hitler's men are searching for the hero, and he's escaping. He's trying to escape by using the ship. And all these people, they travel towards the harbor, and on the way they are being questioned, they are being searched, their bodies are being touched inappropriately, they are being searched, and only a few of the lakhs reach the ship. And the capacity of the ship is only 6,000. Only 6,000 people can travel in that ship, but more than 10,000 civilians, injured soldiers, and nurses and doctors, they all get on the ship, and the ship sets to sail away from Germany. But then in 1945, on January 30th, the ship is attacked by Russian torpedoes, and the ship sinks. Okay. And the ship sinks, and 9,400 people on board, they die. And in the story we have, even while they're dying, when one character comes to know that the person who was traveling all along with them is not a German, this German man tries to kill the other man. Already they're dying, but he doesn't care. He's so much into racial superiority that he tries to kill another man while they're sinking. Okay, that is how much they're all racially brainwashed. And you have many characters not surviving the story. They pass away in the waters, and this pregnant girl, she gives birth to a girl child, and she dies in the sinking. And later we have the ending is with a little hope, where that baby grows up, and she comes to know of her mother's graveyard somewhere near Poland, and she plans to visit that place. Only the hero, heroine, and the baby survives. Okay, so this is based on a real life incident, and until I and all read this novel, I didn't know that such a ship existed, and 9,000 people passed away because mainstream history or mainstream literature doesn't talk about such things. Okay, collective consciousness about such history is not there. So this is one novel as an example for historical trauma, where the voice of the voiceless had been silent for so many years, and this author had made it her task to come out and talk about it, the trauma of her ancestors. And I told you, right, the father's cousin, she had a ticket for this ship, but in the end she did not board the ship. So that is how she's alive till now. So that is why she told this author to write the story. Okay, and the next story is The Girl Who Wrote Loneliness. And if you're interested, you can go read South Korea's history, how Korea became North Korea and South Korea and all that. And Korea was colonized by both Japan and America for a brief few years. Okay, and while Japan colonized Korea, they established industries and all in Korea, and in the 1920s and all, and they made people work, Korean people work for lower wages or no wages at all. And these in like all historical stories, we have women being abused, Korean men being abused by putting in a lot of work for the Japanese industries and all. And after Korea got independence, South Korea did not become a democracy immediately. They had military dictatorship where military generals ruled the country for many years. And during that time, they had this industrial revolution where during 1950s to 1980s, they had this industrial revolution where South Korean military leader, he started setting up a lot of industries in South Korea, and the people who started working there were young girls and women. I just have one picture for you. And particularly during the 1960s to 70s, we had migration of young girls and women from the countrysides to the cities to work in industries. They'll work for like 12 hours, 12 hours continuously in the industry, like industries like electronical industries, where they'll make radios and televisions and all. And these girls have to put together the parts for the equipments. And they worked in toy industries, they worked in wigs industries, where they have to use the needle and thread with their own hand, and they have to stitch the wigs. And they worked in many such industries. And all these girls were young girls who were sent away from their family in the countryside, and they were like 14 years old, 16 years old, and 20 years old, like that. And they came to the city and they started living in one small bedroom, one small room, which will be shared by 3-4 girls. Or if they come as a family, that one room will be shared by the brother and the sisters and the cousins, who all stay together. So the author, Kyung Suk Shin, she came from such a background. So the novel, The Girl Who Wrote Loneliness, is semi-autobiographical. And this is a very impactful story which talks about individual trauma and historical trauma, the history that happened during the 1960s and 70s in South Korea. And she has been a witness of all that. Okay, she didn't, unlike Ruta Sepetis, she didn't hear it from her relatives. She experienced the whole thing. The experience of being a factory girl, of working in factories. And she went back to a very small room which she shared with her cousin and her older brother. And they had this night school system that the factory provided, but the condition was that you should not join any unions, or you should not ask for extra wages or anything. Only then you will be provided with night school education. So that is how the author studied. She went to night school, and she survived in a small room, and she felt very lonely, unable to relate to her older brother nor her cousin, because they had their own problems and dreams and all that. And she makes friend with a neighbor in her apartment, and in her building actually. And that neighbor girl, she, even though they're of the same age, she's more mature and all that. And in the end, the neighbor girl, she commits suicide. And that impacts the author a lot, that even after she grows up into an adult, she writes a book based on her experience in the factory. She becomes very successful, but her identity is fractured because she keeps remembering her past. She keeps thinking about how she was stuck inside that factory, how she was sexually manipulated, or sometimes even abused by the male workers there, and how she had to fight for everything, for food, for education, to stay in a safe place with her older brother, how she had to fight for everything in her life, and how in spite of everything, she was not able to save the friend who committed suicide. So this haunts her forever, even after becoming an adult. And as I said, her identity is fractured because throughout the novel, you'll see her jumping from the past to the present. In the present, she'll be sitting in an island, thinking about the book that she has published, and all of a sudden she'll hear a noise or a sound of that dead friend talking to her. And immediately she'll go back to the past, where the friend had to, uh, wash her clothes, or where they were playing together. She'll go back to the past of happy memories, and suddenly she'll come back and she'll feel very lonely. She'll disconnect her phone, she'll not talk to anybody. And if somebody asks about her book, she'll be very ashamed of it because of her trauma. For other people, it's like she's talking about the experience of factory girls, and she's bringing to light what happened actually. But for her, it is her personal trauma, and she's not able to face it, and that disrupts her identity as a woman and as a human being as well. So these are two very powerful novels which can be given as examples for trauma literature. These are contemporary novels. You can go and buy them and read them. So this is my understanding of what trauma studies is, and what traumatic literature is, and how to approach trauma literature is, when you look at a book, you will go through all the terms of, you have to look whether it is based on gender, or post-colonial, or individual trauma, or even familial trauma of domestic abuse, violence, rape. So you must know what category is there, and whether the trauma is represented directly or indirectly by the author. And you must know how to read between the lines, and you must be able to comprehend the level of trauma that the person had to undergo, and the level of resilience and courage for them to put it into words for people to read. So this is my presentation on trauma studies. I hope you found it very useful. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can ask me. Trauma studies include the environment. Yes, sir, it does include the environment. We'll have eco-criticism also coming under trauma studies.
Yeah, good morning, ma'am.
Yes, good morning.
I'm Ridhima Bhalla this side. Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful presentation.
Welcome.
I just want to know how can we relate trauma studies to the diasporic literature? As even in the case of diaspora, we also see that there are identity crisis and a state of aporia for the individuals, right? So what are your views about it?
So actually, I thought of giving an example from the novel The Namesake by
Yes.
Jhumpa Lahiri. Yeah, so diasporic experience also can be traumatic because of the migration process and learning a new culture, getting to know a new culture. That is not a simple process for everyone. And when you read The Namesake, you will know that there are intergenerational trauma present as well in the novel. So when it comes to diaspora, you can talk about intergenerational trauma, the trauma of displacement, being displaced from your hometown, home place to to an entirely new place. So concepts like displacement and intergenerational trauma can be seen in diasporic studies.
And ma'am, can you suggest some good books from where we'll get the reference of this intergenerational trauma and the displacement?
Intergenerational trauma. Actually, I referred a book called Routledge Companion to Trauma Literature. You can try that.
Okay.
Or I could suggest some books to the organizers. They'll forward it to you.
Yeah, either the bibliography section, which
Yes.
which you made, which you referred at the time of making this presentation.
Okay.
Routledge Companion to Trauma Studies, right?
Trauma literature. Yes.
Trauma literature. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Sophie, I have a question.
Yes, Eunice.
Your presentation was very good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And my question is there any relation between nostalgia and trauma? Can we consider nostalgia a kind of a trauma?
Yes, nostalgia can be traumatic because I think that when your present is very traumatic, you go back to your past where you have good memories. And I think trauma is one of the reasons that you become nostalgic. When everything in your present goes very bad, or when you face some traumatic incident in the present, you think of going back, thinking of the past where everything was good. So nostalgia is being very fond of your past memories. So trauma can be a reason for you to go back to the past.
Thank you.
Yes, and trauma and repression. Repression is when we suppress our. Can you repeat that question, M. Aishwarya? I guess. Trauma and repression.
Is there any connection between trauma and repression? Repression is.
Okay, so trauma and repression, yes. For example, in colonial literature, you can see people not being able to express their trauma properly. And can I give an example like The Wretched Earth? I think I forgot the novel's name. Okay, but there is a connection between trauma and repression because whatever is repressed inside is what comes out in the form of literature. So, of course, there is a connection.
Okay.
Okay, animal studies can be included. Yes, animal studies, the way we abuse animals or the way we take care of animals, all that can be included in trauma literature. I haven't read on that topic, but I can suggest you some books. I'll suggest the books to the organizers and you can get the list from them. This was by Rajita. Okay. Suggestions of libraries. If you are in Chennai, you can go to Anna Centenary Library. It has a very good collection of recent books when it comes to literature. In other places, I do not know. In Chennai, Anna Centenary and Kanimara Library will be good libraries for you to go. Okay. Sports fiction, of course, we can apply trauma theory in sports fiction. Yes, actually, there are a few novels which talks about sports, trauma in sports. Recently, we had, not recently, a few years back, we had doctor, ortho doctor, sexually abusing more than 40 girls who were gymnasts and athletes. And these girls, they all filed a case against this doctor. And there has been books, non-fiction books about such experiences in sports, trauma experienced in sports. And I think there are a few novels as well based on trauma in sports. Yes, Maya Angelou's is based on her experience. Yes. War narratives. Harshavardhani ma'am, I think you can go with all the theorists that I mentioned in the presentation. Herman Oppenheim, and you can go with Freud. You can talk about all the concepts that I spoke about, shell shock and PTSD. And you can go for particular authors who wrote on war narratives, and you can make use of the theories that I mentioned in the presentation. Mental disorders. I did an MPhil project in a novel called The Vegetarian by Han Kang. You can read that novel for mental disorders. I'm giving you examples from contemporary works. So this vegetarian in this, somebody's audio is disturbing. Okay. So in this novel, The Vegetarian, the girl, the protagonist, she believes it's not a girl, it's a woman who believes that she's a tree, and she stops wearing underwear. She stops eating meat and anything related to meat, and she stops eating proper food, and she calls herself a tree, and she stands upside down. Okay. Saying that she needs the sun and the water to survive. She doesn't need food. And when people probe into what is the reason for such behavior, they realize that she had been traumatized by her father in her childhood by killing a dog on the road. Okay. So that traumatizes her to not eat meat, and this reaction comes after so many years. She was traumatized as a child, but the symptoms come when she's an adult. So you can try reading The Vegetarian by Han Kang, a good example for mental disorders caused by trauma. Trauma theories. 1 minute. Mental disorders. Traumatic experience confined only to the past. No, the present. The present, as soon as you have a traumatic experience, nowadays social media gives you the platform to express your feelings and emotions. But once you sit down and write a novel, it becomes a part of traumatic literature. It is not just about the past. People who have experienced traumatic situations in the present, particularly during the COVID situation. After the COVID lockdown, we had many people publishing books based on their experience during the COVID lockdown, how they had to manage their family, their work and all that inside the house, and how some people lost their loved ones, and they wrote novels and poetry collection based on that, how they faced that trauma of losing a child or a parent to COVID. So it is not, trauma literature is not only about the past, it is very much present in the contemporary situation as well. Mental traumatic literature. Okay. Colonization and trauma in Indian literature. As far as I know, it's there's one by Babsi Sidhwa, right? Ice Candy Ma'am, I think, and then Train to Pakistan, and God of Small Things. These are all based on colonization and trauma. And trauma, when it comes to trauma, you have Sashi Deshpande's novels. One particular novel that I found very interesting was The Dark Holes No Terror. It is about familial trauma where there is abuse within the family, between partners, both mental and physical abuse is there, and how one of the partner is being traumatized by that abuse and what are the steps that she takes to come out of that trauma. So you can try Sashi Deshpande's works for trauma in Indian literature. Midnight's Children, yeah, that is a good example. And even Mahesh Dattani's works. Okay, short stories by Mantu. Okay. That Long Silence is also by Sashi Deshpande. Any other questions? I think more.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes. Yeah, hi.
I'm Swagatare,
Yes.
and it is a really wonderful presentation. I just have a query.
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, is there any basic difference between memory studies and trauma literature? I mean, in memory studies, we do include trauma also.
Yeah.
So, what is? Yes, ma'am.
I think they are interrelated. They are not the same, but they are interrelated. One cannot exist without the other. So memory studies include, historical memories, and that memory can be traumatic or it cannot be. It might not be traumatic as well. But trauma is a part of memory studies. As much as how memory studies is part of trauma. As I said, it is interrelated.
Ma'am, that means we can take trauma studies into clinical account.
Yes.
Yes. So clinical account is more towards trauma rather than memory studies.
Yes.
Is it like that?
We can say that it is like that.
Okay, ma'am. Okay. Thank you
Okay.
so much, ma'am.
Yes, yes. Psychological criticism is when we analyze a character and we try to understand that character as to why they are behaving that in that way. For example, when there's this Greek example, right? Agamemnon and his daughter. The daughter hates Agamemnon so much, but she also is very loyal to her father. She doesn't know her father much. Agamemnon is a Greek king, and the daughter has not spent a lot of time with her father, but she's very much loyal to her father, so much that she hates her own mother. Yes, Electra. And that is called Electra complex, right? So when we analyze a character for why they are behaving in a particular way, that is called psychological criticism. When we have some traumatic incident that makes them behave in a particular way, that's trauma. Something that has impacted their identity or character, making them behave in a particular way, that's trauma. Psychological is when we apply concepts to understand a character. For example, Hamlet, the classical Hamlet, why he keeps procrastinating. Is it a touch of Oedipus complex, or is it just because he's mentally disturbed that he keeps procrastinating, killing his uncle? So that is called psychological criticism. Trauma, on the other hand, is when you have experience something very impactful or very critical that alters the way you look at life, and that alters the way that person behaves in relationships in day-to-day life. That is trauma. So I have just given a very brief introduction to what trauma is and trauma studies. There are a lot of resources available in JSTOR and in online mediums. You can find a lot of ebooks and all related to trauma literature and trauma theory as well. You can refer to them as well. This is just a base as to what I spoke about. So yes, thank you all. Anything else?
Professor Joy.
Yes, ma'am.
As a member of the Almonds Club, I was always struck by your passion and dedication to literature. And
Thank
you
you,
are such a voracious reader too. So my sincere gratitude for making this session informative. And you also made the complex concepts accessible to all of us. You really used a clear and concise language, and you really provided many real world examples to illustrate your points. Enjoyed the session.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for patiently listening. Thank you.
Can I add you in the FDP WhatsApp group so that
Yes,
we can
ma'am.
share some books?
Yes, ma'am, definitely.
And your
I'll do
email
that.
ID too, so that they can be in touch with you if they are
Yes, ma'am,
interested.
definitely.
I also got a message from one of the research scholars of
Okay.
PSG College, and she's doing on trauma theories, and she's also interested to ping you.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to add that there's an upcoming course in SWAYAM called Trauma and Literature by an IIT professor. If you're all interested, you can join that course as well. It's starting in January, so you can enroll in that course now. Trauma and Literature by an IIT professor. I found his previous course very useful, so I think this one also will be very good. Okay. So thank you. Okay, one person has asked a question. Trauma linked to addiction and rehab. So as I said, addiction or substance abuse is one of the side effects, or I cannot say side effects, one of the outcomes of trauma. People usually get addicted to drugs or alcohol. I'm not saying trauma is the only reason. Trauma can also be a reason for them being addicted to substances. And rehabilitation will help them to come out of that addiction. At present, before and all, it was not very effective, and people committed suicide after substance addiction and all that. But I think in one way or the other, trauma is related to substance addiction, because research is confirming that people who have experienced traumatic incidents are the ones who usually go for compulsive or addictive drinking or drug abuse and all. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joy Sophie ma'am, for gracing us with your valuable insights and expertise on the profound significant subject of trauma theories. Your dedication and commitment have left a permanent mark on our learning journey today. So on behalf of PG and Research Department of English, I extend our sincere gratitude for your time, dedication, and the knowledge you have shared with us today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And lastly, to express our gratitude and appreciation for this session, let's have Dr. J. Mary Stella, Assistant Professor of English and Research Guide, to deliver the vote of thanks.
As Professor Mary Stella is not available, I am going to propose a vote of thanks. Respected dignitaries, esteemed faculty members, dear participants, the gratitude fills my heart as I extend sincere thanks to each person who contributed to the success of this significant event. A heartfelt thank you to Mrs. T. Eunice Alomi for her eloquent introduction, to our esteemed chief guest, Ms. Joy Sophie, who added grace to this evening. Special appreciation to Mrs. J. Christy Lydia Johnsy for her soulful prayer, and Dr. M. Beulah Hemalata for the warm welcome extended to our esteemed chief guests. We sincerely appreciate the unwavering support and guidance provided by the principal, Dr. B. Jawahar Samwell, and the college secretary, Mr. S. Premkumar Rajasingh. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the organizing committee members whose dedication and tireless efforts behind the scenes made this event possible. Your commitment and to excellence has been truly commendable. I also want to express my appreciation to Ms. Joy Sophie, our esteemed chief guest, for her enlightening talk on trauma theories. Her expertise and insights provided a valuable learning experience for all attendees. Kudos to Mr. T. Jude Livingston for his commendable comparing skills, guiding us through this memorable event seamlessly. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge the active participation and enthusiasm of the event's participants. Your engagement and energy contributed to the vibrant atmosphere and made the event truly memorable. As we conclude this enlightening session, I invite you all to stay tuned for our upcoming sessions. Your continued participation and support are invaluable to us as we journey through more enlightening discussions and learning opportunities. Thank you all for your presence, support, and unwavering commitment. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamlin, for those heartfelt words of gratitude. As we draw this insightful session to a close, I extend my sincere gratitude to each one of you for your active participation and engagement throughout the session. Your eagerness to learn and contribute has truly made the session enriched and meaningful one. With that, we conclude today's morning session, session 1. Kindly participate in the afternoon session, session 2. It will start at 2 p.m. Have a wonderful day ahead.